That's the sweet sound of game companies making insane amounts of money, using the same clever psychological tricks that gambling companies and casinos do. The three main tricks that loot boxes use are: number 1, a variable ratio reinforcement schedule, in which a response is reinforced after an unpredictable number of responses. In the context of loot boxes, this means that since the rewards are random every time, there's no way to predict what you'll get. There are no patterns, where for example every 10th loot box is better than the others. This in turn means that it's impossible to predict when the next big win is coming, and this uncertainty tempts players into opening more because you never know, the next one could be the big one. Number 2, artificial scarcity. Just like in real life, things that are rare or hard to obtain are considered fundamentally more desirable. As noted by user experience designer Chris Harrison, rarity is a massive driver in games. As soon as something is rare, it becomes intrinsically valuable to the player. And number 3, a strong user experience that emphasizes positive audio-visual feedback. This use of audio design to create positive feedback is what we'll be looking at in more detail today. Let's start by taking a closer look into the psychological impact audio can have on people. In a paper published in the Journal of Gambling Studies, a study was conducted that examined the role sound played in providing positive reinforcement to individuals playing on slot machines. Results showed that use of the auditory reinforcement influenced the players' level of both psychological and physiological arousal, as well as causing players to significantly overestimate their win rates on the slot machines. Clearly, sound design can have a profound impact on the user experience, so let's ask ourselves, how can we craft a positive and satisfying auditory experience that leaves the consumer wanting more? For that, we need to find out what makes sound satisfying. It's a fairly elusive question, but we needn't look further than the environment around us and the interactions we have with it to find some answers. Our responses to sound are created by linking the sound to the experience we associate it with, whether that experience is positive or negative. This is a psychological phenomenon known as classic conditioning, or more famously, Pavlovian conditioning. You may have heard of Pavlov's dog experience, in which Pavlov would ring a bell every time the dog was given food. Over time, this led the dog to build an association between receiving food and the sound of the bell ringing. After doing this a number of times, ringing the bell caused the dog to start salivating even if they weren't presented with any food. Let's look at a more everyday example, the sound of a bottle or can being opened. This can be a pleasing sound to hear as we associate it with the experience and reward of the drink connected to it. Coca-Cola uses this to their advantage in their advertising, reinforcing the association between the sound of a can opening and their own brand.
Nice.
The sound design in Overwatch uses this principle for their hit marker effect. In the collector's edition sourcebook, sound design lead Paul Lackey describes where the inspiration came from. In his words, when you hit someone, you need to know you made contact. The sound needs to cut through the mix but not feel like it's coming from any hero. It went through tons of iteration. Finally, one night I thought, it should be satisfying to hit an enemy. Just think about what's satisfying. Beer. So I literally opened the can. The sound is reversed and tweaked a little, but that sound is our hit pip.
A legend falls.
Association with a reward is one factor that makes a sound satisfying, but it's far from the only one. Another key element is the feeling of tactility and the association with physical feedback and our sense of touch.
Can't touch this. You can't touch this.
Tactile actions like flipping a light switch or typing on a keyboard can build a very strong association between the physical sensation and the sound accompanying it, and this association can make mechanical sounds feel very satisfying. In video games, this can be especially important because of the tactile nature of using a controller or keyboard to play the game. If you press a button to perform an action, the audiovisual feedback needs to feel satisfying. Jonas Tyroller demonstrates this perfectly in his video, Can We Make This Button Fun to Press? Link is in the description as always. And in his words, humans like to have an impact on their environment because it gives us a sense of control and power. Applying these things in the context of loot boxes, The experience is designed to build anticipation of a reward and make the sensation of opening the loot box feel impactful and satisfying. Imagine if you clicked on a loot box and it simply displayed the contents without any fanfare. It will be much less of a rewarding experience. Now, with a better understanding of what makes a sound satisfying, let's have a go at making a satisfying loot box opening sound of our own. Ta-da! Let's take a look at the structure of a few loot box opening sounds and see what the common elements are. The process of opening a loot box can be broken down into 4 sections, with the sound design working to highlight each one. These are the activation, the confirmation sound that happens when a player presses the button to open the loot box. This part of the sound makes use of the tactile sound design we looked at earlier, often consisting of a sharp transient that gives the player clear and immediate feedback of the button press. Next, the drum roll. This sound is all about building suspense as the loot box is opened. Typical examples might be a whooshing sound or a literal drum roll, but the sounds used for this section will be very dependent on the specific animation used by the game. This builds into the grand opening, a big dramatic effect as the contents of the loot box are revealed. This sound will often have another strong transient to it to make the reveal as impactful as possible. Finally, there is a reveal. The types of sounds used here will vary depending on the style of animation or presentation used. Some reveals show the contents of a loot box one item at a time with a strong impactful presentation of each item. While others present all the items at once and use subtle ambient effects like a shimmer or sparkling sound. In both cases, the intent is to make the contents of the loot box feel special and valuable. This effect may also vary depending on the rarity of the items received, with unique effects for higher tier items. Additionally, some loot boxes have little musical stingers that play when opened, but we're going to solely focus on the sound today. Let's examine Overwatch's loot box sound specifically and see how we'd go about recreating it. The best way to break down and analyze the sound is to use an EQ to isolate the low, mid, and high frequency parts of the sounds. This makes it easier to pick out the individual layers that make up the overall sound and identify the roles that they play. First, let's listen to the low frequencies, which we'll define as everything below 300 Hz. The purpose of this layer is to make the sound feel big and give it a sense of weight and impact. The sounds we can hear in this layer are the whooshes, explosion, and impacts, as well as the low note of the melody. Next, the mid frequencies. This layer is made up mostly of mechanical and impact sounds that give the sound body and texture. Lastly, the high frequencies, which are responsible for the detail and sparkle of the sound. The content of this layer is made up of lots of transient heavy mechanical sounds as well as any sparkling or shimmering elements. With this information, we're now ready to start designing our own sound effect. My first step was to gather a selection of raw sounds that we'll use to build the effect. These include various mechanical sounds like locks, door handles, lid, etc. Impact sounds like a big box or chest hitting the ground, some coins and other metallic or sparkly sounds, and a rope or cable swimming around, which we'll use to make our whoosh effect. For this project, I used samples from my mechanics and UI libraries. These are collections of sounds that I have recorded and curated myself, containing over 3,000 high quality samples that you can get access to as a Patreon supporter. This is the Reaper project that I used to create the sample. I've divided the effect into 7 different layers, which are the whoosh layer, a high mechanical layer, a mid-range body layer, a transient layer, a low impact layer, a texture layer, and a sweetener layer. This is quite a large number of layers for one sound effect. In sound design, generally less is more, as the sound effect will usually have to play alongside many other sounds, as well as dialogue and music. In those cases, it can be important not to make one effect too overpowering and leave space for the other sounds. However, loot boxes are often opened outside of gameplay, with few other sounds competing for the player's attention. In this situation, you might be able to get away with a busier and more intense sound. However, it's still good practice to go through a finished project and clean up any samples that aren't adding to the overall sound. If you're unsure whether a sample is adding to a sound, solo it and listen to it in isolation, then unsolo it and listen to the full mix. If the sample isn't adding anything, then don't worry about muting or removing it from the project entirely. I ended up removing a considerable amount of samples from this project in this way. I could probably have removed even more sounds if I were to be more critical, but I was happy with the end result. Now let's take a look at each of the individual layers and listen to them in isolation. First off, the whoosh layer. This layer was made primarily by processing various impact samples. These sorts of samples are very easy to record simply by hitting various hard surfaces with a big object. I took these impact samples, time stretched them to lower the pitch, added a low pass filter to remove the high frequencies, and a lot of reverb with a long tail. I then rendered the sample out with the reverb and reversed it, and then cut the transient from the end of the reverse sample. Sometimes you might want to leave the transient at the beginning of the sample if you want a boom effect at the start. But in this case, I just removed it completely. I made an additional whoosh type sample for derotating this by recording a spinning USB cable and adding some compression and reverb. Because all of these sounds sit mainly in the low frequency spectrum, it's important to make sure that the samples sit in their respective frequency ranges, as this prevents samples from competing with one another and maximizes the clarity of the overall sound. Next, the high mechanical layer. These are all mechanical sounds like locks, doors, chests, plugs, and so on that I took from my sample library that help add a tactile feeling to the sound. There are a few extra samples in this layer that give it a bit more character, including a bullet flying past and a ballista firing mechanism. I cut the sample down to just the initial sound of the bolt firing and then used a multiband compressor to bring out the sound of the aid being compressed by the launcher. Lastly, I added a delay called diffuse, which adds a nice spacious element to the sound, but you could achieve similar results with a combination of delay and reverb plugins. The mid layer is made up of some additional mechanical sounds that have been bandpassed to isolate the middle frequencies and give the sound more body. This layer also has a really nice crunchy sound taken from a library, which is a heavily processed sample of ice cracking. The transient layer helps to add a satisfying bite to the sound, as well as providing a point of synchronization with the player's input as they press the button to open the loot box. Most of these sounds, again, come from my mechanics library, but with focus on punchier and more dynamic samples, such as this one of a nail gun. Processing for this layer is mainly a case of using EQ to clean up any unwanted noise in the samples and a multiband compression to make the sound even more impactful. You might be noticing a pattern here. Multiband compression is a very common process with a lot of useful potential. I'll be making a video all about how to use it in the future. As the name suggests, this layer contains some low heavy impact sounds as well as some kick drum samples. All of these samples have been processed with EQ and compression to get rid of any high frequencies and bring out the low end even more. This makes the sound feel bigger, as larger objects create deeper noises than smaller ones when they fall or move. Adding a layer such as this helps to artificially add weight to a sound and is a really useful trick in sound design. As Jonas Tyroller said, Humans like to have a sense of control and power, and the bigger and heavier a sound feels, the more powerful it feels to trigger it. Just imagine pressing this button. Now that's what I call high impact. The texture layer adds some general character to the sound and is comprised of 3 main elements. First is a glass breaking sample that I processed similarly to the whoosh samples, with lots of reverb that I then rendered out and reversed. Second is a fireworks sample with a diffuse plugin and additional reverb. And finally, a collection of random sounds from my entire library fed into a plugin called Wave Warper, which layers them and sends them through a processing chain to create interesting textures. This chain consists of 2 compressors, volume, pan, pitch, and filter automation, as well as additional plugins that can be inserted. The final layer is the sweetener layer, which contains a variety of different coin samples that I process with lots of reverb and a high pass filter to remove any unnecessary low frequencies. The last step is to process these layers using a mastering chain to add an overall coat of polish to the sound. The processing done at this stage is fairly minimal and is just to bring everything together and make the effect feel like one cohesive sound rather than 7 distinct layers. To do this, I use the bus compressor followed by 2 different multiband compressors. The first multiband compressor slightly reduces the dynamic range and makes the sound feel big, while the second one is there to just add a little bit of character to the overall sound. As you can see, the mix control is set to 6%, so it's a very subtle effect. Finally, we add a master EQ to remove anything below 30 Hz, as most speakers and headphones can't produce anything below 30 Hz, and this helps clean up the sound. I also added a small bump at 125 Hz for the low end impact and a cut at 380 Hz to remove some unpleasant humming noises in the mid-range. And there we have it, our own Lootbox opening sound. Overall, I think it turned out pretty well. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. If you want a full in-depth breakdown of the entire process, head over to my Patreon where you can also get access to the UI and mechanics sample libraries that I used in this video. If you enjoy the video and learned something, definitely subscribe and hit the bell so you won't miss any future videos. Thank you so much for watching as always, and I'll see you soon with a brand new video.